Welcome back to the podcast. This week, we're sharing one of my favourite episodes so far, part of our new series of recap episodes. While we're busy producing new content for the podcast, YouTube, and our brand new Patreon channel. That's right, Connect, Curate, Create is now on Patreon. It's a dedicated space to learn, share, and grow together. And here's why we built it. Do you feel like your art is being seen by the right people? Are you getting the kind of feedback that actually helps you grow? Do you have a space where you can learn with other artists who really get what you're doing? If you answered no to any of these questions, Connect, Curate, Create is here for you. Our Patreon community gets exclusive and early access to content, behind the scenes videos, key takeaways from episodes and events, access to live discussions with our guests, and so much more. So, if you're ready to grow your creative practice with the support of a collaborative learning community, click the Patreon link in the show notes and join us today. Now, let's get into another brilliant episode, packed with ideas and inspiration for your own creative journey.
Seeing that actually there's a career and a life that can be made by being a weirdo, but being a really sophisticated weirdo. And I couldn't think of a better weirdo to be. The thing that you want to make sure that you do is always go in the studio. So if there's anything in your life that makes it harder for you to get into the studio, then that's going to be the biggest challenge to your studio practice. The best advice I ever got from Richard Goodwin, who was one of my lecturers, was you just keep doing it. You know, it's not like an athlete where you get worse at it as you get older. You get better at it.
In this episode, I talked to Tony Curran, an artist based in Launceston, Tasmania. Tony shares his journey from studies in psychology and comic book making to his academic research and collaborations which shape his current practice. He offers deep insights into his arts practice, the value of collaboration, and the power of good mentoring. Be sure to check out the show notes for highlights and links that you can use to shape your own journey. And if you enjoy this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell your friends about Connect, Curate, Create. Today I'm in Launceston with Dr. Tony Curran, artist. Tony, hi.
Hey, thanks for having me.
No worries. Thanks for making the time. So Tony, just to kick off, you recently had an exhibition at Space here in Launceston. I wondered if you could tell us about it and introduce us to your practice.
Sure. So the show you just mentioned was called Collision, and it's just come down recently. And it was at Launceston Art Centre Gallery, which is on Invermay Road, right opposite the university there. There is a really beautiful little art supply store there called Launceston Art Centre, who also rent out the adjoining space next door, but their tenant left. And so they opened up a pop-up, and it was a really fantastic series of short-run programs that they're doing of exhibitions. And I was in a group exhibition with the owner of the show, Stefano Campo, and Katie Barron, who's another local Launceston artist as well. And the show was called Collision. It was kind of, I think Stefan just wanted to show to have these three artists in the show because he kind of liked them. We tossed around a few ideas about what perhaps the relationships even were for the show, but I think the impetus was essentially he liked my work, he liked Katie's work, and he's making work as well, but he's so often only seen as the business owner of Launceston Art Centre that it's a really good opportunity for him to actually test out his work in a gallery space. So we were thrilled to be involved in that, and the more we thought about the potential intersections with our show, my work is very pure abstraction, very colourful kind of work. Stefano's is very gritty, sort of harks to aerosol art, street art a little bit, but very much in a language of painterly abstraction. And then Katie Barron's so radically different from both of us, but a super playful artist who can render, junk food exquisitely and so in the playfulness of her subject matter and the sincerity of the delivery of her painting and the skill levels involved, there was just these kind of nice connections between our works, because the colorful language of my work is super playful and wiggly and what I hope is jubilant. And so with that, we thought, well, they're sort of, the practices are so different, but they're sort of connected, that Stefano came up with the show Collision. So that was good fun. But yeah, the works that I had in that show were works that I had exhibited at Griffith Regional Art Gallery mid last year in a show called What a Machine. And the idea of those works were thinking about the way that artificial intelligence creates new artworks, and using the algorithmic processes that those AI technologies undertake, using those as a way to sort of simulate in the studio without actually having to encode it in an AI framework, but thinking through the iterative loops and processes that they go through to make new works, so such as having a sort of genetics of the work, a sort of series of properties of the works that then go through an evolutionary process that's systematic, that then outputs these things, and then they get measured in an ecosystem. And I know I always tend to lose people as soon as I start talking about this, but the result is kind of a series of really energetic, but also hopefully beautifully composed and stable works, where there is a strange kind of latency to where hopefully a viewer comes to the work and can't quite figure out what shapes belong to which color and which shapes sit in front of another, and there's a sort of exciting and fun and beautiful object before them, but one that leaves them a little quizzical and intrigued, and gets them to keep looking to try and resolve the unknown questions about its material manufacture and its possible illusionistic reference.
Yeah, and I've asked you about your work before, and you've shown me and you've talked me through it, and I think that was before a time where I'd actually engaged with any form of AI knowingly, and since then I have done more so, and so even without that reference, I found myself being drawn into the work, and it raising more questions than answers. So I suppose the key question for all of us now is, where did it all begin? How did you arrive at this point? Yeah.
Like in terms of these particular types of works and this language of painting, or?
I was thinking about taking us back right to, what inspired you to begin in the arts. But yeah, if you think it's more appropriate to just talk about this body of work for now, that'd be fine.
Yeah, they'll probably come connected to each other. I had a very musical upbringing, and when I never had any interest or understanding or desire to do art. But when I was studying psychology, did that as an undergraduate degree, and I found that rather than writing my lab reports, I was procrastinating by trying to draw the psychological phenomena that we were learning about in, say, sensation and perception unit, for example, like how stereoscopic or binocular vision works, and trying to figure out, can you draw experiments that, so I became more interested in the drawing side of it. But then I went on a trip to Europe and was just in museums where probably for the first time I'd felt really moved by kind of what art can do and how much diversity of really great art there was. And I hadn't experienced that in suburban Sydney growing up. And so from that experience, I thought I was going to go and draw comic books and make a living doing that, and found my way into art school, where there was a really fantastic lecturer, Gary Carsley, who saw all the things that I was doing wrong in my drawing and kind of pointed out how awesome those things were, or the potential for the things that were failing at the conventions, and then looking at those things and then seeing, okay, well, if you elaborate on that, you find a sense of originality, but it also opens up ambiguities, and it opens up questions rather than fixes meaning, and it enables a work to have greater complexity and interest. So for the first time at art school, seeing people like him and people like Richard Goodwin and Michael Essen showing really, beautiful work, but then also dabbling into conceptual terrain, and then seeing that actually there's a career and a life that can be made by being a weirdo, but being a really sophisticated weirdo. And I couldn't think of a better weirdo to be. So then I guess after art school, after psych, I went to art school, had that experience. After art school, I kind of tried to exist outside of the academy for a little bit. I got a studio residency, I remember at Fraser Street Studios, and just had a really great couple of years. But I had fallen in love, and my wife had gotten a really fantastic job opportunity in regional New South Wales. And we had a range of cities that could have been stationed in, but it had to be regional New South Wales. And so there, at Wagga Wagga, there was an art school there, and I had been considering doing postgraduate study because at the time it was looking like the best arts funding available.
Right.
So I went in and completed an honours degree there, and quite quickly was offered marking work and then teaching work as I enrolled in a PhD and continued studies down that way. And in the PhD program, the art and psychology thing continued to intersect. And my PhD research was really around, we have these conventional forms of art making, for example, portraiture, but the way that we understand human subjectivity has moved so far beyond what it was in 1850 when the National Portrait Gallery was legislated in England. But we're still held to those conventions. And so what kinds of painting or making can we make that help us to articulate the changed views in science and philosophy and psychology around what a self and what a person is? And I found that part of the answer to that question was painting's intersection with technology. And so that sort of trajectory kept going after I finished my PhD, and I moved away from portraiture and was doing collaborations with computer scientists at the ANU and poets and printmakers, and in that process distilled my studio practice very much into a language of pure abstraction, partly so that it could navigate all these different types of projects, but also because I started to learn that the thing that was really fundamentally of interest to me was a push-pull between the feeling that an artwork can convey of freedom, either in the subject represented or in the artistic expression of the thing, and constraint. So I was interested in, we live in such a constrained age now. Everything's very accounted for. The neoliberal sort of structures that we find our way in, where we're constantly plugged in. But that what we all yearn for is a kind of liberation, a jubilant liberation from that. And so I've kept certain types of formal elements in my work and used and limited those very strategically so that the work very much becomes a push-pull between systems-based art making and that feeling of the thing being alive, so the thing simultaneously being imprisoned but also rising above its prison.
I was going to try to draw a conclusion around cognition and art, but your work is much deeper than trying to understand cognition. I mean, so, the intersection between psychology, but then you talked about, more than human, non-human cognition was where I was thinking, but I'd be wrong.
Yeah, it's that. Well, in painting in particular, actually, probably in all art that we value, there's, I think, an attitude that an audience brings to it when they revere an artwork. They're revering it as a quasi person. So there is, I think, in the reverence of nature, or the reverence in art or craft or design, there is this reverence of, this is not human, but it's as human as human. Maybe more human than human. I'm sure some people would save an artwork before a person, depending on their moral compass. But the paintings that I make, I call them attention machines, and a big part of the reason for that is that I want to give someone a stimulus that, on the one hand, doesn't look that complex, but then as soon as you're, I guess, seduced into looking at it, there is a great amount of complexity, visual complexity on offer, that invites you to keep looking, which I guess is I think of these things as machines that get you to cognate, to get there and attend to different parts of it, and slow down your thinking and become present, like aware of the present moment of the thing in front of you. And that's really important to me in this moment, where I, as much as everybody else, am, victim to quick thinking, the doom scrolling, the sort of digital culture that we find ourselves in, where we're invited to make quick decisions, and we rarely make good decisions when we make quick decisions, but a lot of how we're invited to make quick decisions, to rely on unconscious biases and snap judgments, a lot of that is actually facilitated by the technology and how the technology is designed. And a lot of the design features have to do with formal elements in painting, right? So, a red notification on an email app is kind of telling you, look here, something is necessary and important. And these things, they almost feel like visual itches on our devices, and we have to sort of press on them and answer them. So we're sort of getting more and more visually conditioned in these formal elements to feel emotively around things like color and tone. So if we take away all color and just work on tone, say, our phones don't seduce us as much. So I'm really interested in this particular place that we're in, where we have these attention machines in our pockets, these things where we're invited to direct our cognitive energy to constantly. But the purpose of that is mostly so that we can press on things on it, so that corporations can track our interests and behaviors, develop psychographic profiles to sell to advertisers. So our cognitive energy has money making and value potential for a lot of people. So and then if we expend it on things that make us make those snap decisions, actually it wears away our cognitive resources. And then we don't have as much time to spend on the things that are meaningful to us. But if you can, and I'm really interested in the research around present state awareness, where if someone spends more time attending to the present moment and the things that are in front of us, rather than representations of things on our phones, if we pay attention to the things in front of us, we actually build our cognitive capacities so that we have more focus and more mental and emotional resilience, and we can we can make better decisions, and we don't get depleted, right? So it's kind of like exercise and a muscle versus junk food. And, I'm kind of interested in that discourse and how art can make the world a better place, with the knowledge that artworks are there, here and now, in the present moment. And if we pay attention to them, they can actually help us be better people.
Yeah. You mentioned you're interested in the research. You did your PhD, you are an academic. And so I guess coming back to that, you apply an academic lens to your work. You talked about some of your collaborations with people across different academic disciplines or different practices completely.
Yes.
So Yeah. How do you think your work has changed over time as a consequence of applying more of an academic lens to it?
Yeah, for me, that's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. I think my interests were there a long time ago. So I've got these kind of lowbrow interests. Like I still, music, pop music, house music, and things inform my painting, right? Like the corn chips of the studio. It's a weird metaphor. Anyway, but then I remember being in psychology, for example, and being really interested in the philosophical underpinnings of that stuff, and even as a kid being really interested in sort of philosophical questions. I didn't have a good academic training to navigate any of those questions, but then going through university and starting off in a place that wasn't an art school got me to get trained in a scientific method. It was a Bachelor of Science, which then got me thinking about, okay, well, how do we know that something is true or not true? And then going into an art school where a lot of the assumptions that are produced are untested, that they're inherited, they're challenged, but they're inherited, and they're not tested the same way that other disciplines test them. And so there's some really interesting gaps about, okay, well, what are some ways to test some of the assumptions that we have around the value of art, what art can do for us. Initially, it was questions like, what can science contribute to, say, our understanding of art? And so I remember finishing art school. I did a master's after I did my psych degree. I went to COFA and did a master's of drawing. It was a master of art brackets drawing. And after that, my mother-in-law actually gave me a book called Art and Visual Perception by Rudolf Arnheim, which she had when she was, I think she got it in the 70s. So I read that book and I was like, oh, right, there's this really interesting field between art and science that connects there. And so I got hungry for it then, and then started to find artists that were also drawing upon or interested in the embodied viewing of art and how art and science can connect. So people like Olafur Eliasson had an exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in 2008, and I was doing a residency for Art Month Sydney. It was a critics in writing thing. Went to see that show, wrote a review of it, but that show really profoundly moved me about how he draws in natural phenomena and then discourse on that from science and philosophy, and just sort of seeing how those things can infect and inform art. And then having gone in to a PhD and been trained in the research methods of studio practice and what undertaking systematic research means in the studio, and then understanding and theorizing about it in the context of what's come before and what else is around, then starting to go, oh, okay, well, it's actually not just these other disciplines that can inform and infect art, but art has this, its own contribution to make. But I still don't really want it to sit in the silo away from other discourses. I'm really keen to continue to have it enmeshed to shape other disciplines and to be shaped by other disciplines.
Yeah, I would agree. The point you made earlier about how art can make us better people individually, but also I think societally, culturally. It's enrichment. And I saw Olafsson's exhibition at the Tate a few years ago. I mean, it was more of an experience, I think, and just the different media being used and how a lot of people, like families, really enjoying it and having these joyous experiences of it, and then going through I think there were projections on a wall and everyone was taking selfies, and then the next thing you have to do is to walk through a cloud, and you don't know where you're going, and so that sort of embodied immersive engagement in artwork that, yeah, as you said, you were inspired by the work that you saw, and then how, yeah, those kids I saw playing in the mist, and with the selfies and everything, what will they go on to do themselves? And so, yeah, it is yeah, it's more than just cognition. There is something about how, it is a thing for good, shall we say? Yeah. Let's I did sort of want to get back to something you said earlier about when you first went to art school and your mentors, your lecturers, your tutors, they were pointing out or helping you to see some of the things you weren't doing formally or whatever, and encouraging you to explore that. How is that? Is that I guess that carries through in your own practice, but then as an academic now who lectures at UTAS, is that something that a practice yourself that you that you employ when you're working with students?
Yeah, I'm a big believer. That's a good question. I'm a big believer that the best results come in an art studio. I think the best results come from encouragement. It's not always easy to be generous in that way when you're. So I guess I do that because I think particularly when you've got a younger student who doesn't have and nor should they have as wider understanding of the field as you have, but they have a real talent or a real facility that is somehow hemmed into conventions that you can see because you've seen so many different types of work, and you're so across the theories and discourse that you can kind of put names to it, and you can kind of draw out their attention and put it in a vocabulary that they can understand, and show them artists that can help them get there. I kind of tend to take one of two approaches, which is doing what my lecturers did, point out this part of it is interesting, and invite them to kind of amplify that. But the other thing might be that perhaps they should learn from those conventions that they're in and introduce them to a range of artists that are using those conventions maybe better, maybe worse than the students. But then I find that showing them that those examples help them to make that decision up for themselves. Do I want to go down this path and compete with or be better than or have to learn this vocabulary, or do I want to differentiate and go down that path of the thing that's more but the other thing, like when I was in art school, part of it was also laziness, because as soon as someone gave me an out, like, you can either become an amazing drawer or you can do something really interesting with this thing that comes super naturally to you. My lazy kind of attitude then as a young dude was like, I'm going to take that. And I sometimes still do that in the studio. And I think that's really important to sort of, I'm a big believer in attending to what comes naturally, because what comes naturally to you doesn't always come naturally to someone else. And so sometimes my wife has this saying, you don't always have to walk a mile in the desert on your knees.
No. And that's how I use AI. I'm no longer walking through the desert anymore. It's all those little jobs that I procrastinate over. Like the first thing I did on ChatGPT was asked it to. I gave it some information about my history of distance running. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't done it for a few years, and I wanted to get back into it, and asked it to write me a running plan.
Nice.
And there it was 2 seconds later. But this is something I've been procrastinating over for months.
Yeah.
And next day I was out running.
Yeah, I've got this great app called Pi, spelled P-I, and it has a really jovial kind of American accent, and you can make phone calls with it, and you can ask it all kinds of things. But I've found it so helpful to diagnose all kinds of kind of questions or sticking points that I have in sometimes studio practice, right? So I've got this, I just ordered a new airbrush. It was a spray gun, mini spray gun. And I connected it to my compressor. Compressor wasn't big enough. So I type into this thing, hey, I've got this model mini spray gun with this model compressor. This doesn't have the grunt. What can you recommend that does? And then it'll give me a very specific product recommendation based on, and it'll tell me why that thing and what variables and what flow rate that gun needs and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, 100% AI in the studio. Really helpful.
Yeah, but I suppose about drawing comparisons between ourselves as academics and the jobs we do and AI and the jobs it does, when you are working with students, you are inviting them to explore what's comfortable for them, and where you have a choice to do what's most natural to you. To perhaps encourage them to consider doing the same. I mean, some people I know through their practice, I would be one of them actually, what I would call an arts practice, my photography.
You can call it an arts practice. I'll call it an arts practice with you. It totally is an art practice.
Thanks, Tony. But it has been about trying to work through a certain thing that I've needed to work through, and I've come out the other side of it now, and I'm asking what it is about that, and perhaps that's something that we all need to go through and find. Okay, what is it? What is the secret sauce, perhaps?
Yeah, I remember. So I was teaching in Canberra for a while. I've taught at a few different universities until landing here in Tas, and one of the head of painting at ANU recommended a book called Art and Fear, and it was a really interesting book they recommend to people who are finishing, because in third year, for example, students start to get a little, I've been in this really great environment and I'm about to lose that the studio space. I'm about to lose the contacts with people that can look at my work and provide valuable input and impact. But I hadn't read the book, so I read the book, and one of the best nuggets of that book was that the thing that you want to make sure that you do is always go in the studio. So if there's anything in your life that makes it harder for you to get into the studio, then that's going to be the biggest challenge to your studio practice. And sometimes that's like, finding the time to do it. But I've found, and I'm sure others have found this, that you might have all the time in the world, but you're still not getting in the studio. And sometimes that's because you don't feel good about the studio. So with students in particular, if we can drive engagement and get them to not even think twice about picking up a brush, and to not think twice about, if it's painting, to not think twice about coming into the studios and using them and making the most of it. We want them to think critically, and we want them to make, strategic choices when they make an artwork. But the first thing we want them to do is show up. So making them feel like they belong there, that they are the type of person that can make an artwork, and that they have those kind of insights that are valuable to make an artwork, then I think that's half the battle.
Yeah. Where's your studio?
It's in the garage. I can show you.
Oh, thanks. I look forward to seeing that after the interview.
It's not very inspiring.
No?
No.
But you get in there often.
Yeah.
What you don't have any barriers to getting in there.
Yeah, that's right. So when I was living in Wagga Wagga and then in Canberra, I had studios that I had to travel to, usually not very far because it's regional spots. But here I'm lucky to have a garage that, while the garage needs a lot of work, I'm not working on the garage. I'm working in the garage from time to time, and it's right here. And so if I'm home, I can duck in and do a quick thing, and which can turn into a long thing, but that's okay because, I can pack up pretty quickly and just walk in the door. It's a beautiful way to work.
Wonderful. And so being able to just duck in and assume with the day job, so you, as a lecturer at the university, that affords you some time. Again, before the interview, I asked you how I should announce you, and you opted for artist, and you said that, in the context of your lecturing, you are an artist. So you seem very clear on your identity there. So how does that affect your relationship between your day job and your artistic practice?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what an artist does can mean a range of things. I think, in the sense that we might expect an artist to be in the studio 5 days a week making work, but sometimes a good day in the studio is just being in the studio and figuring out what the right next move is, and being really deeply engaged in that. And what's interesting about being a lecturer is that in a classroom that continues to challenge you and continues to rethink, what are good moves, and you see this diversity of emerging artists in their choosing and testing things, that you get to see like a laboratory of experiments, and you get to feed some of that into your own practice as well. So it's kind of, I don't think the uni would want me if I wasn't an artist, and I don't think the artistic practice would advance as deeply as it does without that. And the teaching's only 40% of the role.
Yeah.
So another 40% is doing the research, which can include having exhibitions, so long as they're a comprehensive contribution, and then there's other things like service and engagement. So in that kind of portfolio, often we might think about a university lecturer as someone who teaches, but the informs the research, and the research informs the teaching, and then particularly if you're in a city like Lonnie, quite quickly you're enmeshed in service. Like, so for example, I'm on the board of Sawtooth Ari, which is where I first met you. So being involved in the community as both an artist and a lecturer, I think that seems indispensable to Sawtooth, to have on their governance, to have a mix of that. So it's a funny enmeshment. I know people that like to say, I'm an artist before I'm an academic. But if you hear me talk about my practice for half a second, you know that I'd be doing all the research without the job.
Yeah.
If I didn't have that 40% research allocation, I'd still be reading books from the frontiers of psychology or journal articles and things like that, so long as I had access to a university library. So it's a funny thing. I see it perfectly as intertwined.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I think, that's always the sense I've had from our conversations, Tony, is that, yeah, you absolutely love what you do, and those intersections that having an academic job allows you to explore, and they're enmeshed. I mean, I see them slightly differently as an academic from a business school. It's very hard to integrate my arts practice into that, but I did it. I actually managed to do that. So
you wrote a book on it.
Well, I did, but thanks. It's I suppose, I mean, the way you speak about these intersections, and there seems to be a flow. The way you talked about you having your studio in the garage, and the way you work, it sounds all very appealing in terms of lifestyle and work and the intersections between the two. So, would you recommend a career in academia to artists?
Yeah, I would. Absolutely. Here's the hard bit. It's getting there, right? So I think anyone that has a profile, maybe not anyone, but it can be a tricky terrain to navigate to an academic career that can involve a lot of casual and precarious employment. But I think as an artist, unless you have some kind of fund that can support you, or a family or a patron that can provide that for you, it's a pretty precarious existence, because you can either have money or you can have time, and no matter which one you have, you put into the studio, because the reason that you're the artist is not because you're in it to make money. Usually it's because you love making something that has a really profound aesthetic resonance, or can be a really nice pressure point on society, like a nice activist, sort of thing. And so if those are your priorities, then you need to make money to pay the rent and do all those other things, but then every other cent that you make tends to just get funneled into that. But I don't know. I agree with Jerry Saltz, who says, a life in art is probably worth more than, any kind of. Here's how I think about it. People get incontinently wealthy, and then they get to a point where they need to buy art, and they've prioritized money for perhaps their whole lifetime, and they've finally got to a point where they're retired and they're not worried about not having enough money. And so rather than having the money, often they spend it on the art. So either way, you can either have money or you can have art. If you want art, you have to spend money.
Yeah.
And if you want money, you have to sacrifice art.
Yeah, sure.
For most people.
Yeah, no, and that is that's the problem, and very much, I suppose, my own experience is one of, at a very early, formative age, making a choice between not necessarily making money, because I'm not a rich man, but certainly to go out and get a career in something that was understandable to my father. But I think to make art doesn't necessarily make sense to a lot of people, but we, as you said right at the beginning, it's art is cultural production is so important to the everyday, and so the role of the artist is so important, yet undervalued. But in terms of, and I suppose there aren't that many jobs in art schools anyway, so for anyone who goes on that journey, wants to go on that journey that you've gone along, that you've said is actually quite a rocky road to follow, quite a precarious one, that you followed. Not everyone's going to.
I think it's also the timing.
Yep.
I think the timing of coming through that, like finishing my PhD at the time of a change of government, where Australia Council was halved its funding, at that period of time.
Yep.
And university art schools were in a decline for probably the last 10 years. There are all of these factors that are so outside of the artist's control, but are so cyclical anyway, that as the wheel will turn.
Yeah.
If you get in when it's high, it'll turn down. And what I have seen is if you get in while it's down, it turns up a little bit. And I don't know, you'd never know how long those cycles are, but I think the best advice I ever got from Richard Goodwin, who was one of my lecturers, was you just keep doing it. It's not like an athlete where you get worse at it as you get older. You get better at it. So it's an old person's game. Carmen Herrera was not really discovered until she was in her 80s.
No.
Yeah.
So just to come back to your own practice and your work as an academic, just what I suppose the thing for me is whilst there are different ways artists might navigate that dichotomy, if you like, between art and money.
Yeah.
The academic life, so to speak, the academic work, it suits your practice in particular. That's what I'm getting from you, Tony, is that very much it's something that you, as you say, you'd be doing the research anyway. You'd be seeking out access to the knowledge in order to inform your own practice. So maybe that's not for everyone.
I don't think so. And I've got one particular person in mind who I won't tell their story, but they did take on an academic position for a short-term contract, and they had scope to keep that continuing, and they decided it wasn't for them. They think about making art they think about art in ways that I have a lot of parallels with, and I love talking to them about it because there's such good conversations. But they don't need they have done the PhD, and they don't need but they don't need that access to do it. They don't need scholarship in order to feed their work. In fact, they can feed it without it because of their attentiveness and passion and access to great museums and things like that. So it can feed that. And so I think that's right. I think what you need is a way where you can go deep into it. And anything that can feed a depth of it is really valuable and important. And sometimes that might be if you can deal with a life where you don't have to have flash things, if you don't need creature comforts, if you can live on not very much and spend all the time in the studio, and if your family has the same values, then you can go to museums because they're free most of the time. You can see brilliant works. You can be enthralled by exhibition openings because they're free to attend, and chips and drinks and all that sort of stuff. So a life in art can be rich without it being financial. But then if you can go so deep in it and feed the studio, then this particular person that I'm thinking of, is doing extraordinarily well in their practice by any measure. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, that sort of, finding that way to nurture your practice. And as you say, there are just so many options out there. Yeah, to be part of a community, to be in dialogue with the wider world, I suppose, as well, or to be in dialogue or be part of the arts community.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What would you be doing if you weren't doing what you're doing now?
Far out. What a good question. So during COVID, I did step away from academia because jobs were drying up and I was casual. And I was able to secure the odd part-time thing, but nothing sustaining. So I did leave that to manage a yoga studio. But I would probably be cobbling together a range of freelance activities that included whatever I could do musically, whatever I could do. I'd probably be a yoga teacher or something like that.
Yeah. I've considered it myself.
Yeah, and during COVID, I did do yoga teacher training because quite a few teaching gigs dried up, and I was stuck at home, and those kinds of things came online. So that was an interesting kind of soul-searching time. But to be honest, it's really interesting what I did do in COVID. I did that, and I started working really small, and I started being very careful about what I showed, and I started becoming really private about the work. What I discovered in that was that if I didn't have any position in the art world, I was still going to be painting and I was still going to be making, and I'd probably have just become what we call a soul painter. That is someone that doesn't get any exhibitions or accolades or whatever, but is just devoted to making really great artworks.
Yeah.
So I would have liked to have thought that that's what I would do, but I was tested, and that is kind of what I did. So I was pretty thrilled about that.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. Well, as you said, we are here in lovely Lonning and the sun is shining. The last question I ask everyone is, why Tassie? Why Tasmania? If you could put it in 3 words.
I got hired.
Thanks, Tony. I really appreciate your time and all of your deep insights.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Connect, Curate, Create. I hope you found inspiration and insights that you can apply to your own creative work. For highlights and links, check out the show notes, and be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast player so you never miss an episode. Tune in next time as I continue to explore life and work in the arts.